Hello class. So today we would be talking about the synaptic transmission which occurs at the neuronal junction. So let's look at some basic anatomy of the axon terminal and the synaptic end bulb. So over here, this is the very end of a neuron. As you can see over here, you have the presynaptic neuron, then you have the postsynaptic neuron. On this presynaptic neuron, you have synaptic vesicles composed of these neurotransmitters, and then you have the space, the synaptic cleft between the two neurons, the pre and the postsynaptic neuron, and then on the postsynaptic neuron, you have specific receptors, which are very important for those incoming neurotransmitters, which we would be discussed. Okay, let us look at the steps which takes place between these neuronal synapses. So, the nervous system depends on these chains of neurons, think of them as like wires, which is connected by junctions called synapses. This space between one neuron to another neuron. That's why this lesson is called synaptic transmission at neuronal junction. These synapses is what allows those signals to go from one neuron to another neuron by traveling across the synaptic cleft. So, how does this happen? The first thing that happens is the action potential reaches the axon terminal. So, step one, as the action potential propagates along the axon of the neuron, eventually it will reach the axon terminal or the synaptic end bulb, the very end of the neuron. And as it reaches the very end of that neuron, we will have the calcium voltage gated channels opening. So in step one, as the action potential arrives, the calcium voltage gated channels will open. Remember, there is higher calcium on the outside rather than the inside of the neuron. Now, those gates will open, causing the increase of calcium within the neuron. Step two. Now that we have the calcium increasing within the neuron, this will then result into neurotransmitters being diffused through the synaptic cleft. So this space over here, synaptic cleft, we would have these synaptic vesicles with these neurotransmitters to be released across the neuron. So in this space of synaptic cleft. So it's going to go through exocytosis. Okay? That is step two. Step three. As the neurotransmitters have been released across the synaptic cleft and is now going to the postsynaptic neuron, as that signal is being sent, they will bind to specific receptors. So the neurotransmitters will bind to specific receptors on this postsynaptic membrane, which are these chemically gated ion channels. The chemically gated ion channels will open, allowing the movement of ions in and out on this postsynaptic membrane. And depending on the channels that are opening, this can result into a graded potential, which is referred to as postsynaptic potential for the very end of a neuron. So it is the graded potential for this postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so let us look at the postsynaptic potential. Postsynaptic potentials are, as I mentioned, a graded potential which occurs at the postsynaptic membrane of a neuron. So the neuron after the pre, right? The cleft here, and then the post. So it is the graded potential which occurs at the postsynaptic membrane. Now, similar to the idea of graded potentials where they can depolarize and hyperpolarize, here they can either become excitatory or inhibitory. Okay? So these postsynaptic potentials, which occurs at the very end of the neuron, the next neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, will happen at the cell body or the dendrite. So that's where we can see these postsynaptic potentials occurring at the cell body or the dendrite. So, excitatory. When it is excitatory, this means that the postsynaptic neuron membrane will be going through depolarization. That means that when the neurotransmitters are being sent across the synaptic cleft, it will result to the opening of specific channels, sodium or calcium channels. Now, for that to occur at the postsynaptic neuron, we would have specific neurotransmitters that needs to be released. So that would be acetylcholine, ACH, or glutamate. So it can't just be any neurotransmitter. It has to be these types of neurotransmitters. And then we have inhibitory. So if excitatory is going to allow depolarization of that postsynaptic membrane of that postsynaptic neuron, in inhibitory, we have hyperpolarization. So instead of becoming positive, more positive, it is going to be more negative. So this is going to be due to the opening of potassium or chlorine channels. Now, similar to the excitatory, there are specific neurotransmitters, and this time it is not ACH and glutamate, but rather it is glycine and GABA. Okay. Before today's lecture end, I want you guys to remember that with these postsynaptic potential, just like a graded potential, they can allow action potential through summation. Okay? So, one of the things I want you to remember is the synapse. These postsynaptic potential can synapse into more than just one neuron. Usually we're talking about one neuron and another neuron, presynaptic, right? And postsynaptic. There could actually be multiple neuronal synapses, which we don't really talk about here because it goes into much more complex details than we have to know. What I mentioned about the summation, how it's similar to the graded potential, is that if the postsynaptic potential basically goes through summation, and if enough area is depolarized and it spreads across this axon hillock here, we can actually have an action potential. So think of like how it's becoming more positive and a little positive and a little positive. If it reaches that threshold, another action potential can occur here in this next neuron, and it can go through the whole process where it propagates along the axons and so on and so on. So basically, the sum of excitatory postsynaptic potential and inhibitory postsynaptic potential will help determine if there is going to be an action potential on the axon hillock. Okay? Because if there is more inhibitory, well, there's not going to be an action potential, wouldn't it? But if there's more excitatory postsynaptic, well, there'll probably be an action potential. So that is for today. It's very short. So have a good day.